start off with something that is monitorable, managed, and provable. And then nothing radical, nothing really new. It should be happening. It often isn't, but there's no real reason for it not happening. But even where it is happening, it stops somewhere around about release for production or sign up in production. The addition to this is that when you have a code base that's been released, and with your continuous improvement, continuous deployment model, that becomes easy. As long as it is deployed, you maintain testing for that particular version. If you're a one-shot wonder and only have one product, you probably lose interest long before your product has expired. That leads to a lot of problems to the people using it. One-on-one if you're dealing with consumers, but if you're dealing with a corporate, they're left with orphaned code that they often don't know how to protect. And orphaned code with poor management of users is one of the favorite mechanisms, because the people that have been in your business the longest know where all the cracks are. So David, you're waving a hand at me.
Thank you, Steve. I just had two questions to ask you. Would we include the use of open source code or not, as the case may be, in this framework? And then the second thing, just relating to what you just said about, you know, if you lose interest, what about escrow? And I know that we buy OEM software, then escrow is like buy what you get what you buy. But if you are doing developments, particularly if you have a third party developing the code on your behalf, and then the third party, I mean, there's potentially IP discussions that need to happen there, but also regarding if the third party goes bust or something, and then at least you have a copy of the code that they were developing on your behalf in escrow.
Yeah. It's what you do with that code. I agree. Escrow is important in a lot of places, particularly if it's custom written code. But you need a version of that code that you can run static and dynamic tests on. The static test is basically the vulnerability of the day. In other words, it's a dynamic situation and it evolves. The dynamic is making sure that your code still does what it's supposed to do, because dynamic code exploits is mostly where people are able to log in without using accounts or to create fake accounts because the application isn't properly monitored. All the fun things when we discover we have 100 extra employees or we have 5 extra system administrators who keep deleting the logs every night. They're variations on the same theme. So escrow code, fantastic, but if it's static escrow is pointless. It needs to be active and used. Oscar.
Hey, Steve. Quick one. Just on you make reference to the kind of controls as part of the code development. I'm making the assumption, but as opposed to assuming, let me rather ask, that the controls would then live up to that custody of trust construct, considering we're dealing with fraud here. So it's kind of baked in, so you have that caliber of quality in it.
Probably not right now. I'm finding it very rare.
Yes.
The idea, there's this concept called code provenance. It comes from your supply chain disaster stories, where code that you didn't even know existed becomes a part of your product and you sell it. And that code is then compromised. It's sometimes accidental. In the last couple of years, we've had deliberate inclusion of compromised code. But where you have deliberate inclusion of compromised code by an outsider, it's not difficult for that to become an insider. And sadly, the insiders know exactly where to go first. So part of the process here, I mean, I'm aiming for an ideal world, but if we only get 10% of the way towards it, I think we're ahead. Is that the smart guys on the inside occasionally get tempted. Can we put enough hooks into our design process that if someone is tempted to insert a personal payday component, that it could be spotted. I say could, but our process would need to at least put some obstacles there to dissuade the unwary.
Yeah,
ideally, if we got this right, it would be a would be detected, in which case we've changed the game.
Yeah, and if people can appreciate that call it the caliber of that control lives up to the nth degree as per custody of trust construct when it supports forensic investigations, then to some extent that should also contribute to be a bit of a deterrent.
Well, just identification. Every time someone does a commit, can you link that to a username and a password or to a signing key? Simple things like that make a magic change. Half of all commits to GitHub are by multiple people using shared accounts. How many of those code modules or code snippets end up in other people's projects or products? And it then becomes, if I've just downloaded an open source code base from GitHub and I've just adopted it as myself, basically cut the strings, do my software quality people know the provenance of that code? Do they think it's mine? Okay, they wouldn't think it's mine because I can't write code to save my life. But what if I said I did? And I committed it in, and it's got the old rounding error. Every spare 7 cents goes into a bank account. Not that anyone would ever do such a thing, but you know, 10 million times around that loop, it gets interesting. Would we spot that code if we have a problem? 2 years down the line, someone says, oh, this particular library was infected. You can now plug into it from, I won't say Russia, because I think they're having a problem with the telephone lines right now, but somewhere like that. Would we know if we'd used that code? That same code provenance is the foundation for code integrity. If people know that every line of code can be linked to a user, your motivation to change the code base fraudulently is diminished. I wouldn't say it goes to zero, but I think it improves our chances. Plus, for code quality and stability, it goes off the radar. Yeah. I don't think I'm dreaming because I was talking to people today who actually are doing this. Some even work for banks. So how do we add that up? Because literally this is a secure software development framework or secure software development lifecycle. This is pretty much standard model for people writing code, adopting code, and deploying bespoke code today. Wouldn't say everybody's there, but all the tools needed for that exist today. And I have Darshan waving at me.
Yeah, thanks for the opportunity, and apologies, sort of got halfway into the discussion as well as the actions. I just wanted to add into the discussion around, because what we're really talking about is DevSecOps and the associated culture and maturity within every organization that does software development, specifically around their customers themselves. I just want to emphasize the fact that it's really important to do DevSecOps maturity assessments regularly, purely to understand the nature of maturity and consistent application of things like SAST and DAST testing across your development CI/CD pipelines themselves. That's the one thing. The other thing is you can have close to absolutely 100% secure code. But what we found is that if there is insiders or attackers that really understand the nature of customer journeys that are involved in, let's call it related transactions for procurement of service or procurement of product, and those particular customer journeys are compromised, we deal with a different situation. And that's where let's call it the technical fraud issues creep in. So you can have secure code, you can have signed code, you can have users that are, let's call it, vigilant around protecting their, let's call it, passwords and not displaying them, or at least revealing them in GitHub repositories. But at the end of the day is if you have, let's call it, suspect customer journeys that don't look after proper authentication and authorization, that don't look after...
That's exactly where we're going. I'm talking about the foundation. If you can't trust your code, you cannot trust your logs.
Exactly, yes.
But in many cases, sorry, Billy, you've had your hand up for a while.
Yeah, thanks, Steve. Yeah, I wanted to say thanks for the insights, especially around secure coding and all that. So we've got a block within the fraud framework that is called security management, or ISM, if you want to call it that. Within that security framework, we have secure code development as a different capability. So we wouldn't, from the fraud framework, directly call SAST or DAST, but it is implied via the security management layer that, you know, all the stuff that security does, log retention and backups and all of those things are there.
That's great. That's absolutely essential. And just following on, I'll come back to you, Billy. I don't think you finished.
Okay.
But
cool.
Having code that is recognized is a starting point. It doesn't get us to where we need to be unless we start putting certain capabilities in that code. Most of what you're describing, Darshan, it's what I call, having got scars from my time in telcos, we have the swivel chair interface, which is basically legacy integrating with legacy, integrating with legacy, integrating with a stone tablet. Everywhere that there is a human interface, there's opportunity for that transaction or that process to be transactionally corrupted. And that's a lot of that's due to invisibility. Those old code applications never actually logged the user or gave you a state report. So it's almost impossible to run forensics without going into the actual application, looking inside a database. They never reported it outside the app. So moving ahead, okay, that's still a problem that's not going to go away, by the way. But if we're developing new applications, we need to build in process metering by design, which comes back to certain components and certain capabilities that we put into our build cycle. So you don't invent a new API call, you use an approved and signed API call, and we check to make sure it's been included. So even if you do something weird in the code, there's always going to be an entry that weird action 99 was triggered. What we do with that data is part of fraud hunting. But if we haven't got that data, we're starting in the dark. And in a nutshell, that's where I was heading. Secure coding, the proper monitorable plugs in the code. We expect someone's going to try and defraud us, so we add the right triggers that can't be taken out. And then moving on, and this is where I was going to hand it over to someone smarter than me, I hope. What do we use for that data so we can actually start spotting active fraud?
No,
and that would then
fully agree.
That would drive the level of monitoring we should be designing in. Then the trick is to make sure that it gets designed in and it works. It's a different level of testing.
Fully agree with the perspective and the viewpoint. I'm not sure in the categories that we've assigned as part of the framework itself, if we've got something of the nature of process improvement or fraud hunting per se. How do we go about dealing with that? Because for me, it's really important. You get insiders deliberating over customer journeys and processes, and insiders have natural tactics to circumvent those particular processes. And it's secure code that developers have actually developed, proper authentication, proper identity management, and so forth. But yet those particular processes still get compromised at the end of the day. And that's where the crux of the fraud hunting matter actually lies. We need to go and see what analytics, what data can we glean, specifically around logs. I agree with you full-heartedly, Steve. And how do we analyze and produce insights around them? Because those insights will share where we need to protect those customer journeys better.
So I think, Billy, if I recall, we had an interesting conversation last time on forensics.
Correct, yes.
I know a lot of people who do forensics work, and they are extremely competent at navigating around shark ponds to find the minnow. But it's a manual job. What would help you automate that job, and can we design it into the apps from the beginning?
There we go. Now we're asking the right questions, Steve. I think that's exactly where the crux of the matter is. I think, with everyone's siloed approach to fraud, we're missing a massive opportunity to do this forensics across the board.
So I'm kind of handing the baton to you, Billy. What would make your life easier, and collectively, do we know how to make that happen?
So I think one of the challenges that we have, and I think we all collectively have the same problem, is information overload. We've got logs and logs and logs, which generally exist in silos, which generally don't get consumed into a data lake. And even if we did, I don't think we're running the proper forensics on top of that to extract. And I think this is where things like AI and ML is going to be the thing that's going to help us. We need to be able to, when we find fraud instances, we need to be able to go back to the AI and ML and say, look at this. This was a fraudulent activity. Start learning and start developing your own views. Because I think, quite honestly, if we find 10% of the fraud, it's actually quite a lot. On a real-time basis. Most of the stuff that we find is after the fact, when people have shouted that the horse is already bolted.
Yeah. So at that level, there definitely is going to be some level of machine learning, but the whole of cybersecurity is looking for machine learning, and at the moment we're not keeping up with it.
No.
When we are talking business transactions, processes, anything that started, stopped, human interchange is, I look at any time that a human being transfers between systems is a fraud opportunity. Maybe I'm being cynical, but I've had my nose dented so many times in that space. As we move along, even for the old applications, can we add some kind of a breadcrumb that says this transaction had human intervention? Can we take an order of magnitude of complexity away from any ML coding by tagging manual or anything else for automatic? We expect there should be, current standard is no unauthorized, unauthenticated transactions. At some point means an account needs to be compromised or taken over or invented. I'm sorry, I'm literally brainstorming here out in the wild, so no safety net, so please excuse me. Some way of adding breadcrumbs to our logs by design. Because the data we are handling is only going to ever get more detailed. The reality is, as we add these things, like my breadcrumbs is probably an extra 100 bytes, per process. Unless we can do something constructively with it when it gets to your stage, Billy, I don't mind a couple of extra terabytes of log storage if it makes your searching 100 times faster. We exchange data for performance.
Yeah.
Can I make a small recommendation? And I'm not sure how the committee will actually feel about that. But I think we need to lend ourselves in proper understanding of the related business rules and business processes. I'm coming back to the story around customer journeys as well. Without that visibility, you have the tragedy of collecting surmountable amounts of data and delivering insights that are unconclusive or non-conclusive altogether. What I'm seeing is that at the bedrock of our requirement or our framework should sit some level of, and for the better choice of words, a level of data governance. The nature and the quality of data that we're receiving, the purpose of the collection of that data itself, and how we're going to leverage the data in the first place. We typically call that, let's call it journeys associated to customer records, but it's built around the business rules and the business processes associated to the services and applications that we leverage for our customers themselves. If we don't create the starting point as a business process or business insights, we're going to end up collecting logs and sifting through data and leveraging machine learning without any good result. So I'm not sure, maybe someone else has a different perspective, but I think that's probably a good position to start.
I'm completely with you there, Darshan. In fact, you just give me an idea, but Oscar is waving at me. And then David
I actually want to build on Darshan's idea to the extent that if you kind of think about that process in theory should have some kind of behavioral pattern.
Yes.
And actually creating a reference around that pattern that you can measure against, I think will go a long way in helping to support. I mean, in essence, if you kind of look at all the ML being deployed, that's kind of what it does within the environment. But being perhaps more explicit about it from a forensics perspective could go a long way.
I just want to quickly add on before Edison starts. Just around that, business people don't understand, let's call it fraud hunting or threat hunting for that matter. They understand a process for a customer to be customer orientated, first of all, to be simple, to be clear. And on the back of it, because they're within the business environment, they want to create a process where there is absolute value created, not only for the organization, but for the customer at large. So the mindset of a business individual is different from a mindset of someone working in fraud or someone working in cybersecurity or even privacy for that matter. In fact, you can stretch it as far as data governance, because the business individual will want to collect and facilitate the transaction as fast as possible so that revenues can actually be gleaned and profits can be made. So even before we even look at business processes, we need to understand what's the mindset of the business individual and be comfortable with that. And once we're comfortable with it, we can add on and build the requirements for things like fraud hunting, things like threat hunting for those particular processes themselves. Sorry, Edison, you've got your hand raised. I'm not sure if it was Edison or David first.
David, I think, was first, then Edison, first behind.
Yeah, thanks, Darshan. Thanks, everybody. So I just building again also on what Darshan, what you were saying about the business process mapping. The only thing that we and I guess the user behavior analysis that the machines can do so well is crucial here. But what if we have a legitimate transaction where a legitimate user initiates a claims process, and at some stage the illegitimate comes in, a rogue person comes in and continues on the business process and gets the fraudulent payment made, whatever. Because then what we're seeing is that we're still seeing another user following the defined business process. But what we've seen is a legitimate user being substitute for a rogue user. And maybe it's a case of the legitimate user went on holiday for 2 weeks and weren't checking their emails, and while they were away, the rogue user has come in, completed the process. Don't we wish that the world was that efficient, but completed the process for the claim, and the claim is made. And in there, somewhere along the line, some thing has happened, and the payment is made out to a rogue person.
Well, let's be fair, David. It's probably just an innocent mistake, and someone realizes they didn't get kicked for it.
Yeah. It's always
first time.
It always is a case of unintentional, intentional, or malicious, for that matter. But that's what I'm proposing, is that we need to understand those particular business rules and processes, and we really need to hunt as to what potential fraud activity can manifest out of those particular business processes. Like I said before, business individuals don't understand fraud. They don't understand privacy, data governance. They don't understand. And I'm sort of generalizing, because some organizations have got it knacked, some don't. And you can just spot organizations that have lots of fraudulent activity that don't have it knacked. But bottom line here is, the minute you start putting on that fraud hat and you look at a business process or a customer journey, and you understand legitimate versus, let's call it, malicious activity, then you start unpacking specific use cases that you need to address and to improve those customer journeys in accordance to, let's call it, a set of hygiene factors for privacy, cybersecurity, and data governance themselves.
Yeah, I think, Edison, you've been waving your hand for a long time.
No, not that long. So I think many organizations, as you mentioned, they do have some sort of fraud monitoring in place. Are we saying we're trying to detect fraud that does not result from business logic vulnerabilities? Because, I mean, does the fraud have to be detected beforehand, or does it need to happen fast to be able to detect it?
It's exactly what you're saying. There are fraud monitoring tools that are reactive. They pick up fraud once it's already occurred. What we need to do is, like Steve said, bake those fraud requirements by design before those particular customer journeys are launched. And that's the challenge with a lot of fraud monitoring tools, is it's very reactive. It's after the fact. You've incurred, let's call it, losses, and those either those losses cannot be recouped, or you have to write them off.
Yeah.
Edison, if you look at the, sorry, Steve, sorry, I'm speaking out of turn. If you look at
you're waving the hand.
Okay. If you look at the framework that we suggested here, Edison, we've got under the first line capabilities, we've got prevent. So first of all, prevent the horse from bolting, prevent the fraud from happening. Second of all, detect once it's happened, so that you can do a reversal quickly. If you didn't prevent it. Obviously dealing with the response, and finally, being able to predict under which conditions are you likely to income. If you're launching a new app, the likelihood of phishing is high. Or if you doing system changes, the likelihood of while you're in standing fraud is high. So yeah, you want to get to a stage where you want to predict it as well.
Okay, cool.
Yeah, Darshan, back to you.
Just a very short story. Preventative tools and capabilities are great, but they come at a cost. So you need to measure constantly the costs and the cost factors around employment of preventative and detective tools. I know I'm being sort of negative on this particular case, but I found that you put in a lot of preventative tools and it still doesn't help you.
Yeah. And the detective tools, in my experience, the triggers are, we spent how much? Where did that go? And by the time it's in an accounting tag, it's long gone, and then it's panic. And I think that's the kind of thing that keeps Billy busy. But I want to follow up on something you just said a few minutes ago. When we have these business processes, most opportunity for fraud comes from a broken process or an asynchronous process that can be handled in different places. Can we use some of our learning capabilities to detect processes that have unusual delays, not just the system is slow, but processes that stop, halt, or change direction? Because we're still desperately seeking normal. And something you said earlier, Darshan, I think we're talking from the same group memories here, is the people who best know all the gaps tend to be the contractors that are taught to use these systems on minimum wage and probably understand the business process better than the people that designed them. Can we find a way of monitoring those in the background? At the same level, we could do application code. Do we have enough collective wisdom to start looking at process abnormalities? Many of them will be just broken processes, but that would make business better. So it's not a sunk cost.
Agreed fully. I think
could those become part of our breadcrumbs?
It could very well be. But still, going back, the starting point should be the business processes. But just on that topic, it's a starting point, but it's not sort of going to circumvent situations where we have a customer journey that is, be it corrupt or has the situation where a malicious insider or a malicious attacker can take advantage of. So we need to put in, let's call it, relevant fraud controls at the business process end, bake in the necessary reasonable controls. When I say reasonable, is we need to emphasize the cost associated to preventative and detective capabilities. And then within the pipeline itself, employ a level of continuous monitoring associated to those customer journeys, because what really happens in business, and I think this is the tendency across all organizations, those business rules and those business customer journeys change on a regular basis. Today, we're selling, for example, data at a particular price, and there's a new customer journey that free rates the data for a particular service, etc. And next you know, that particular free rated service is exploited. So it's about also continuous management and monitoring of those customer journeys as well.
It helps to know what those journeys are supposed to look like so we can spot irregularities.
So
in the case you're talking about with sort of mobile network products, they're changing almost on an hourly basis. So we struggle.
But surely if they're changing more frequently, you have more data. If you look at an insurance product, I mean, you might have two transactions. You might have the day you take out the insurance policy and the day the person claims on that policy. That's it. Those are the two transactions. And then the premiums obviously would also be somehow viewed as transactions, but those are automatic payments by the bank on direct debit or something. So you may not have enough data points to do user behavioral analysis in certain industries. Like if you do retail banking, that's a very different story. You can see user behavior from retail banking activities. Telcos, I guess there's a lot of data where you can get and other types of retail accounts, but on certain types of industries and financial service, some activity may be very difficult to define a model for end user behavior because the touch points are so few.
Yeah, my perspective on that is it's around the 20% principle. You know, you can address 80% of the fraud, 20% at least circumvents your significant losses. So if we can at least have, let's call it, systems of records that identify and log anomalous activity associated to a customer journey, and we address those 80% of the time, at least you circumventing and reducing your risk to a relatively low risk within the appetite for the organization itself.
Yeah.
So
I agree with you. It is the 80-20 principle is valid. And it's the belief that you'll get caught that or demotivates the fraudster. Inside. The guy outside is another story.
Mm.
Yeah.
By the way,
just on the 20% story itself, you don't stop there. You learn from the 20% threats that you encountered, and you build it into the 80% story again. So it's really about continuous fraud hunting or threat hunting, and ensuring that residual risk is shifting the dial more and more to the low end.
Yeah. And by the way, Darshan, an anecdote that I think you might appreciate. The most dramatic single deterrent event that I was party to, having detected a high rate of fraud in the call center, we arranged for SAPS in riot gear to come in and arrest the guilty party. Fraud in that call center went to almost zero for 2 months.
Yeah, there's significant syndicates that operate in and around the call centers themselves. So either
sadly,
agents
work from home has kind of wrecked that.
Well, I'm not sure really about it, because the syndicates sit outside those agents' homes and either threaten them or bribe them to a certain degree to, let's call it, exchange data of customers, etc.
No, I meant as the demotivator of sending someone from SABS in to arrest you. That doesn't really work if no one else sees it.
Absolutely, yeah, agreed. It's almost a sense of security awareness.
Yeah, so part of our process, there's the opportunistic fraud, which we can demotivate by making people aware that we're looking. And then there's the organized fraud that we basically just need to reduce the flow. And whatever we do, that is an industry that will adapt to our changes. So we can't stop. Okay. I'm enjoying the conversation, but are we getting anywhere near items we should make rules?
Steve, perhaps just a relationship to call out, because we've used the example around insurance, and it's a kind of low transaction volume. So I think there's something to appreciate between high transaction volume versus low transaction volume. And where you've got low transaction volume, it actually necessitates this kind of more integrated approach that we're talking about, that picks up from a business process or a customer journey perspective.
I think that is actually something we should be considering, because the low transaction can be significantly higher value.
Yeah.
Obviously, there's a limit, but in other words, there's a better return to us spending money on making the system less defraudable.
And then, Steve, what you were saying about the touch points where you've got multiple systems, there's greater opportunity to perform some kind of fraudulent activity when you're doing a manual intervention between systems. Of course, on the flip side of that, there's an integration risk that you run if you integrate, particularly integration of legacy systems. You also have a problem of, other issues, corruption of data, other failures, potential may open up other potential risks where you integrate systems.
But this comes back to understanding of the process. Look, it's a while since I was involved in this hands-on. But when you have those process gaps where data from one system is used to originate a new process flow on another system, just ensuring that both systems have proper timestamps, and knowing that, generally speaking, it's going to be between 5 minutes and 1 hour for a process flow to end on one system and a new process flow with the same identity. And anything that is 2 or 3 hours is either a process disaster or a fraudulent insertion. I'm guessing lots of people do that because it was rather blindingly obvious when we did it. But it wasn't designed in as a general process requirement. It just happened. And it was the forensic team who basically said, well, we're finding that all of these high value frauds are originated as if they were a legitimately started process, but we can't find the origination. So we flagged them as frauds and they turned out to be. I'm sure some of that can be automated. But as I said,
can this be done at the enterprise architecture level? I mean, because they would have the views of all the process maps, right?
Yes, it must be. You see, I blame the enterprise architects for still thinking that manual data transfer, cut and paste, is a reasonable step in today's world. I'm teasing, but all right.
If the enterprise architecture teams documented their architecture as well, I think
Yes.
it's a good place to start. But we find in a lot of organizations the likelihood of even HLDs being present is also challenging. Now, I just wanted to add, just in terms of systems of records, the logging information that we attain, one of the, let's call it inhibitors, is just understanding what's the extent and nature of private or privacy implications on their data itself. The collection can be, let's call it circumventing particular, let's call it privacy rules at the end of the day itself. So we must just be mindful. Yes, it's great to collect and have breadcrumbs associated to customer journeys, but at the end of the day, it's also taking in customer information, and we end up, let's call it, compromising some of the privacy guardrails that we need to adhere to.
I appreciate that perspective, but it is one that I would treat very carefully. We have already got the rights to process that information under POPI before they are required. Otherwise, we've broken the law. Collecting that data, validating it and verifying it is 100% within our right to do. Making certain that if we bring in an outside consultant, that we don't break the rules in sharing that data. There I agree with you. But being afraid of processing our data, that just is open for fraud.
It's on the back of breaches in third parties and suppliers that support services, is that some of the organizations don't necessarily process the data but want access from a fraud perspective to the data itself. But it's the third party, be it a SaaS provider or a supplier, that actually processes the data itself. And that's where there's a potential of fraud activity to occur.
But I don't see processing fraud data as being any different from any normal transaction where we've extended a third-party rights to do it for us.
Yeah,
I also agree the irony of a fraud investigator leaking data for the purposes of fraud. But this is the world we live in too.